The door to cell number 12 was not fully closed. Its iron latch rested against the frame, disengaged, as though someone had left in a hurry or never cared to secure it at all. When the guards pushed it open, the hinges gave a dry groan that filled the cramped cell and then fell silent. What they saw inside brought them to a standstill. Correctional Officer Miguel Herrera, 38 years old, lay flat on the concrete floor. His gray uniform shirt remained buttoned, but his trousers had been dragged down to his knees. His throat was ringed with bruises, dark ovals forming a pattern too precise to mistake for accident. The eyes were wide, glassy, and fixed on nothing. His mouth hung open, his tongue pressed out in a grotesque gesture that suggested his final seconds had been spent reaching for air that never came. The concrete beneath his head carried a faint halo of sweat, absorbed into the porous surface. The stench in the cell was immediate and layered stale perspiration, bleach that had not fully evaporated from the last cleaning, and an unmistakable metallic tang that clung to the air. It was the smell of iron, of blood, thin but insistent, lodged in every breath. Under the lower bunk, investigators retrieved a used condom, crumpled and slick, smeared with semen and streaked with fresh blood. Beside it, a long black hair curled against the dusty floor. A leather belt, issued as part of Herrera's uniform, was found discarded near the bed frame, twisted and buckled in a way that suggested it had been pulled free during a struggle rather than placed aside with care. A streak of blood marked the bedsheet of the lower bunk. Diagonal, thin, and strangely isolated, there was no visible wound on the dead officer that could explain it. The stain became one of the first mysteries that refused to leave the file. 2 women occupied the cell that night. Camila Rojas, 29, stood pressed against the far wall. Her hair clung to her face in damp strands, and her white t-shirt was soaked through with sweat, making her appear smaller, diminished, almost translucent under the harsh ceiling light. She spoke quickly, her voice cracked and hoarse, insisting that Herrera had forced his way in, that he had tried to assault her, that she had fought back. Her hands moved as she spoke, touching her own throat as if to remind everyone where his grip had been. She repeated that he was still alive when he fell, as if repetition might turn disbelief into truth. On the upper bunk sat Sofia Morales, 33, her knees drawn up, a blanket wrapped tightly around her frame. She avoided the eyes of the officers, staring instead at a chipped patch of paint on the wall. When questioned, she whispered that she had heard noises, muffled gasps, the sound of bodies shifting, but had been too afraid to intervene. Her voice broke when she added that, at first, it had sounded like they were together. She said no more, burying her mouth into the blanket as though silence might undo what she had already admitted. Technicians moved in quickly, their gloves snapping, their flashbulbs firing in quick bursts. Each photograph caught a fragment of the scene, the body with its twisted posture, the streak of blood on the sheet, the condom curled like discarded evidence of a forbidden act, the belt abandoned as though it no longer belonged to anyone. Every object was bagged, labeled, and carried out, but the smell remained. The initial examination confirmed the obvious death by asphyxiation, consistent with manual strangulation. The bruises on the neck matched the pressure of hands, not a ligature. Defensive abrasions marked Herrera's forearms, and on his inner thighs, faint scratches told of contact more intimate or more violent than could be explained away. Beneath his fingernails, the forensic team later recovered strands of black hair torn out in his last desperate attempt to resist. When prison investigators turned to the surveillance system, they discovered that the cameras covering the corridor outside cell 12 had not failed by chance. For more than 30 minutes, the feed had gone dark, the system overridden manually. The technician on duty swore it was a malfunction, but the logs were unambiguous. Someone had switched them off. No one could say who had entered or left the cell in that window, or whether Herrera had walked in alone. The official notes on the scene closed with contradictions stacked on contradictions: a correctional officer dead inside a women's cell, an inmate who admitted sexual contact but claimed rape, a witness too fearful to provide a stable account, and physical evidence that refused to align. The condom, the streak of blood that belonged to no one, the hair caught beneath the victim's nails, all pointed to the presence of something more than what the room itself wanted to confess. What remained certain was this: in the middle of the night, inside the cell of two women he was meant to control, a prison guard had died, and the silence left behind weighed more than his body on the concrete floor. The two inmates of cell 12 were pulled out separately and led to opposite ends of the interrogation wing. Each was placed in a different room, concrete walls painted in the same sickly beige, with fluorescent tubes overhead that hummed like restless insects. The air smelled faintly of disinfectant, but underneath lingered the stale odor of sweat and cigarettes from countless prior interrogations. Camila Rojas sat first, her wrists shackled to the steel table that reflected the light in sharp streaks. Her posture was rigid, shoulders squared as though the restraint alone could not contain her. Her hair, damp and tangled, clung against her cheek. A strand rested across her lips and moved every time she spoke. She did not tremble. She did not look away. Herrera, she said, had been a predator long before that night. He had targeted her repeatedly, slipping offers and threats into routine encounters. He promised contraband cigarettes, pills, sometimes a small radio. He promised leniency, ignored infractions, favors with other guards if she complied, and if she refused, he promised punishment. That night, she insisted. He forced his way into her cell. He cornered her against the bunk and clamped his hands around her throat. Her voice rasped as she recalled it, as if her vocal cords still bore his imprint. I scratched. I fought back. He lost his balance. He fell. I thought he was still breathing. The words were steady, but the tension in her jaw betrayed her. When pressed about the condom found beneath the bed, her composure stiffened. She did not flinch, but her jaw locked and her lips whitened. She admitted penetration had occurred, but insisted it was rape. He forced me, she said flatly. None of it was voluntary. She did not elaborate. She folded the statement into finality, as if additional words would only dilute its truth. Across the hall, Sofia Morales unraveled differently. She avoided the investigator's eyes. Her gaze locked on the corner where the wall met the floor. She sat hunched forward, fingers twisting the hem of her sweatshirt until the fabric strained and warped. Her breathing was uneven, a rhythm of shallow gasps and long pauses. She admitted hearing noises muffled, indistinct at first, gasps, movements, then silence broken by choking sounds. When pushed to clarify, she hesitated so long the recorder barely captured her next words. At first it sounded like they were together. She spoke so softly the officer leaned in to catch it. She added that the tone changed, that she froze, that she did nothing until the silence became unbearable. Her account did not align with Camila's, nor did it completely oppose it. It hung in a fragile middle ground that satisfied no one. To the investigators, it sounded like indecision carved into testimony. The forensic team soon complicated matters further. The condom tested positive for Herrera's semen and Camila's epithelial cells, corroborating that contact had occurred. Scratches on Herrera's throat carried fragments of female DNA, later confirmed as consistent with Camila's. Yet the lower bunk spoke a different language. Under ultraviolet light, a streak of blood glistened, bright as fresh paint. It was not Herrera's. It did not match Camila or Sofia either. The lab report was clinical, stripped of speculation. Blood belongs to an unidentified female individual. DNA profiling incomplete. No match found in national databases. The interrogators let that fact sit heavy in the room. How could another woman's blood appear inside a locked cell that supposedly held only two, The question loomed without answer. Camilla stared at the wall and offered none. Sophia's eyes watered, but she only repeated that she had not moved from the bunk. Suspicion turned outward. When the investigators reviewed the surveillance logs, the contradictions deepened. The corridor cameras had not failed. They had been deliberately shut down, overridden from the control room for 35 minutes. The technician on duty denied any involvement, panic cracking his voice when pressed, but the log was unambiguous. Someone had blinded the prison at the exact time Herrera died. Within hours, rumors began to spread among the guard ranks. Some said Herrera had always blurred the line between authority and exploitation, too familiar with female inmates, too lenient in exchange for favors. Others whispered that he had been tangled in contraband smuggling phones, narcotics, medication passed through hidden channels. These stories never appeared in official reports, but they shadowed every page of testimony. By dawn, the file named Camila Rojas as the prime suspect in the homicide of Miguel Herrera. Sofia Morales remained only a witness, though her contradictions gnawed at her credibility, and sealed in its vial. The smear of blood from an unknown woman lingered like a ghost, a presence that refused to be erased. The body of Miguel Herrera was transferred to the Forensic Institute of Veracruz before dawn. The van rolled through the streets while the city was still asleep, the interior humming with the vibration of the road. The officer who accompanied the body said nothing during the drive. Silence was protocol when transporting the dead. In the morgue, under harsh fluorescent lights that stripped away shadow and dignity alike, Herrera ceased to resemble a man of authority. Without his uniform, without his keys or his badge, he was reduced to a specimen on a steel table, pale and inert, awaiting examination. The smell of antiseptic clung to the room, though underneath it lingered the faint, sweetish odor of death beginning its work. Dr. Isabel Cornejo, the medical examiner, began her report with the obvious, around the neck. Deep bruising bloomed in uneven ovals, clear impressions of human fingers, 4 distinct finger marks, with the faint arc of a thumb pressing across the trachea. Under magnification, the skin revealed ruptured capillaries, tiny hemorrhages consistent with intense, sustained pressure. Microscopic analysis confirmed traces of epidermal fragments beneath Herrera's skin, female DNA, lodged where the fingernails had scraped, though not yet conclusively matched. Later sequencing confirmed it belonged to Camila Rojas, the inmate who admitted contact. Inside the throat, hemorrhaging spoke to the violence of the grip. The hyoid bone, a delicate, horseshoe-shaped structure at the base of the tongue, was fractured clean through. Few injuries carry more certainty. Such a break is not the result of accident, nor of careless force. It is the signature of deliberate strangulation, pressure applied long enough and strong enough to silence the airway. Elsewhere on the body, evidence accumulated in small but insistent details. Abrasions dotted the forearms and wrists, marks consistent with attempts to push someone away. A cluster of crescent-shaped gouges along the right arm matched fingernail scratches, drawn with desperate force. Beneath his fingernails, forensic technicians recovered strands of long black hair torn free in resistance. DNA testing later aligned those strands with Camila. Lower on the body, investigators cataloged injuries of a different nature. A tear ran along the inner thigh, accompanied by superficial lacerations near the genital region. These, when considered with the used condom, corroborated sexual activity shortly before death. Swabs confirmed the presence of vaginal epithelial cells matching Camila. The physical record left little doubt intercourse had occurred within an hour of Herrera's death. But the autopsy revealed more than what was expected. On the lower bunk bedsheet, a smear of blood had been collected, thin but vivid under ultraviolet light. Tests confirmed it was human blood, fresh, deposited within hours of death. Yet comparison against all known samples, Herrera, Camila, Sofia, yielded no match. The DNA belonged to an unidentified female. The profile was incomplete, corrupted by degradation, and failed to appear in any national database. Dr. Cornejo underlined the finding in her notes. Presence of foreign female blood at scene remains unexplained. It was a quiet sentence, clinical in tone, but it hung over the case like a question no one wanted to ask aloud. Toxicology added another layer. Herrera's blood carried traces of alcohol low concentration, consistent with light drinking earlier in the evening. No narcotics, no sedatives. He had not been drugged into weakness. He had been sober, awake, capable of resisting, and yet he had been overpowered. The autopsy concluded. Cause of death asphyxiation due to manual strangulation. Contributory findings: fractured hyoid bone, defensive wounds on forearms, recent sexual activity. Notable anomalies: female DNA under fingernails, unidentified female blood on bedding. In her final statement, Dr. Cornejo summarized with clinical restraint, but the contradictions could not be smoothed away. Herrera had engaged in sex within an hour of death. He bore the marks of resistance, wounds that suggested a struggle. Yet his uniform showed little evidence of prolonged fight: no torn seams, no ground-in dirt, no bruises on the knuckles as one might expect from a man defending himself with fists. The belt was discarded, but not in a way that clearly fit the struggle Camilla described. The puzzle sharpened around what did not fit. If Camilla alone had killed him, how had she sustained the grip long enough to fracture bone? Given their disparity in size and strength, if she was not alone, who else had entered the cell during the blackout and whose blood marked the sheet? A witness, an accomplice, or another victim unseen? The autopsy did not resolve the case. It deepened it. Every answer came paired with another question. Every wound, a contradiction written on flesh. Inside Santa Lucia, word of Herrera's death spread before the body had even left the gates. News traveled faster than official memos, carried in whispers along food lines, in the shuffle of laundry carts, in the coded exchanges of glances between cells. By the time the morning head count was complete, every inmate knew a guard had been found dead, and by afternoon they knew it was Miguel Herrera. Among the inmates, reactions split sharply. Some muttered that it was justice long overdue. Others kept silent, their silence heavy with fear, as though speaking his name might invite scrutiny. For years, Herrera had been a rumor in human form, a guard who offered favors in exchange for compliance, who trafficked small luxuries into the prison economy, who blurred boundaries until power and intimacy were indistinguishable. Former cellmates of Camilla recounted in hushed tones how Herrera lingered too long during searches, how his eyes traveled like hands, how he smiled when he promised to make problems disappear. One woman claimed he had cornered her in the shower block, pressing contraband cigarettes into her palm as if they were currency for something unspoken. Another said he offered medication painkillers, sedatives if she would keep him company. None of these testimonies had ever entered an official file, but inside the prison walls they were common knowledge. The guards, too, whispered among themselves. To some, Herrera was a colleague, a man who shared cigarettes during night shifts and played cards in the break room. To others, he was reckless, a liability who crossed lines everyone else knew better than to approach. The discovery that he had died inside a woman's cell forced them to confront what they had long ignored. Beneath the surface lay a darker suspicion: contraband, mobile phones, pills, alcohol. All of it found its way inside somehow, and Herrera's name often circled in the same breath. Some believed he managed a pipeline, coordinating with other guards who preferred cash to loyalty. If that was true, his death might have been less about lust and more about silence. The technician, Olivares, who swore he hadn't touched the cameras, became another node in the network of suspicion. Inmates gossiped that he had been seen speaking quietly with Herrera days before, their heads bent close, their conversation cut short when others entered the room. No one knew if that was true, but the story grew each time it was retold, gaining detail like moss on stone. At night, in the common areas, the rumors mutated into theories. One version held that Camilla had acted alone. A guard tried to rape her, and she fought back with a desperation that turned lethal. Another whispered that she and Herrera had been involved for weeks in a clandestine relationship, and the night's encounter had shifted suddenly from passion to violence. A third theory, quieter but more dangerous, suggested that Camilla had not been alone, that someone else had entered the cell during the blackout, someone whose presence was written in blood across the sheet. The unexplained blood became the centerpiece of speculation. Some inmates said it belonged to a nurse who slipped in with a master key. Others that it came from another prisoner allowed to roam during the blackout, protected by corrupt guards. One whispered that it was Herrera's wife, smuggled in during the night by officers who owed him favors. A suggestion so absurd it was dismissed outright but still repeated, because in prison absurdity and truth often blurred. Among the staff, a colder calculation prevailed. If Herrera had been involved in smuggling contraband, then his death might have been orchestrated to erase a liability. A dead man cannot testify, cannot expose a chain of complicity. The deliberate shutdown of the cameras reinforced this fear. Someone with access, someone trusted, had intervened to blind the system. That act suggested coordination, not chaos. The prison's administration, aware of the growing storm, issued a memo forbidding discussion of the case among guards while on duty. But orders cannot silence curiosity. At meal breaks, the speculation sharpened. Who had access to the control room? Who carried keys to cell block D? And if Herrera was silenced, who benefited most from his absence? For Camilla and Sofia, these whispers never reached their ears directly, but the atmosphere shifted around them. Guards stared longer when they passed. Inmates approached them with guarded questions, wanting to know if the stories were true. Some treated Camilla like a symbol of defiance, others like a pariah who had brought unwanted attention. Sofia was left adrift in the middle, her contradictions turning her into a target for suspicion rather than sympathy. By the time the trial approached, the prison was already divided into factions. Some saw Herrera as a predator who had finally paid the price. Others painted him as a victim, a man murdered by an inmate who had manipulated her way out of responsibility. And in between were those who believed in neither version, that the truth lay with the unseen, the unnamed, the woman whose blood marked the sheet but whose presence had never been accounted for. In Santa Lucia, truth was always a currency, and someone was always profiting from its absence. The courtroom of Veracruz's criminal court filled before the first gavel struck. Guards in pressed uniforms lined the walls, their faces carved into masks of authority. Reporters shuffled for position, pens and cameras poised, each hunting for the moment that would become a headline. Families of inmates sat stiffly on the benches, their whispers rising and falling like waves. The air itself seemed charged, as if the room anticipated violence even in silence. When the bailiffs escorted Camila Rojas to the defendant's chair, the space held its breath. Shackles clinked as she moved. Her prison uniform was clean, her hair tied back, but her eyes betrayed exhaustion, dark circles, the residue of nights without sleep. She sat rigid, refusing to glance at the gallery. Every gaze was already upon her. Prosecutor Alejandro Cruz opened with words sharpened like knives. He strode to the center, his voice projected with the confidence of a man convinced that the evidence was immovable. "The facts are plain," he declared. A correctional officer entered cell 12. Minutes later, he was dead. The defendant admits sexual contact. The scratches on his neck bear her DNA. His fingernails carry her epithelial cells. There is no mystery here. She killed him. He paused to let the statement settle, his eyes sweeping over the jury. Behind him, photographs flickered onto a screen. Herrera in uniform, smiling with his children, then Herrera's body on the cell floor, trousers undone, eyes frozen wide. The juxtaposition was deliberate family man versus degraded corpse. Cruz let the images do the work of testimony before words resumed. Defense attorney Lucia Herrera, no relation to the victim, rose in contrast. She was calm, measured, her voice softer but deliberate. Where Cruz hammered, she wove. My client did not kill out of malice. She began. She defended herself. Officer Herrera had a history unspoken, undocumented, but known. A pattern of coercion, a trail of threats and demands. That night, he forced himself into her cell, forced himself upon her body. She fought to survive. Gasps rustled through the gallery, some disbelieving, some affirming. The defense attorney did not raise her voice. She let the weight of survival hang in the air, heavier than accusation. Camilla herself was then summoned to the stand. The chains were removed from her wrists, but not from her ankles, a reminder to everyone of who she was. Her voice was low, steady, stripped of ornament. He came in after lights out, she said. He told me I would do what he wanted, or I'd pay. He grabbed my throat. I couldn't breathe. I scratched. I pushed. I thought he was going to kill me. I did not want this. I did not want him. Her testimony was not theatrical. It was flat, factual, and it carried the sharp edge of someone describing survival rather than seeking sympathy. Some jurors leaned forward unconsciously, as though caught by the gravity of her words. The prosecution countered with their own witness. Sofia Morales shuffled to the stand, her eyes darting between the floor and the judge. She swore the oath with trembling lips and kept her hands knotted in her lap. "What did you hear that night?" Cruz asked. Her voice faltered. "I heard noises, movement." "Describe them." "At first I thought they were together." The words emerged reluctantly, nearly swallowed. Murmurs stirred among the spectators. And later it changed. I heard choking, gasping. When I looked, he was already on the floor. The prosecutor seized on the inconsistency. "So which is it? Miss Morales, was it consensual or was it forced?" Her lips trembled. I don't know. It sounded like both. It sounded confusing." Confusion was not what the jury wanted, yet it was exactly what they received. Her testimony painted a shifting picture that satisfied no side fully. To some, her words corroborated Camilla's account of sudden violence. To others, they suggested complicity disguised as panic. The forensic testimony followed, delivered in clinical tones by Dr. Cornejo. She spoke of the fractured hyoid bone, the bruises patterned by fingers, the semen confirmed inside the condom, the epithelial cells lodged beneath nails. She laid each fact before the court as a surgeon lays instruments on a sterile tray. But then she addressed the anomaly. The blood recovered from the lower bunk does not belong to the victim, nor to the defendant, nor to the witness. It belongs to an unidentified female. Its presence at the scene remains unexplained. The defense seized on this with surgical precision. "If another woman's blood is in the cell," Herrera argued, "then another woman may have been present. The cameras were deliberately disabled. Who turned them off? Who entered that cell unseen? And why has the prosecution chosen to ignore this?" Cruz objected, dismissing the question as speculation, insisting that Camilla had motive, means, and opportunity. The judge sustained the objection, but the seed of doubt had already been planted. As the first day closed, the courtroom held more tension than resolution. Camilla sat pale under the fluorescent lights, her hands folded tight. Sofia avoided her gaze. The jury retreated with images of a dead officer, the words of a conflicted witness, and the echo of a single unresolved question whose blood marked the sheet. And why was her presence erased from the official story? By the second week of hearings, the case had already consumed Veracruz. Outside the courthouse, crowds gathered in restless knots. Some carried hand-painted placards with Camila's name scrawled in black, demanding justice for a woman they believed had been forced into violence. Others shouted for punishment, chanting that she had seduced and killed a man sworn to protect. The sidewalks became a theater of accusation and defense, each side convinced of its own truth. Reporters circled like carrion birds, notebooks open, cameras flashing. Every day, headlines framed the trial as something larger than a single killing, a collision of sex, power, and corruption inside prison walls. Some papers painted Herrera as a fallen hero. Others suggested he had been a predator cloaked in uniform. The narrative shifted depending on who was selling it. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was no less charged. Prosecutor Cruz returned with sharpened resolve, determined to fortify his case. He presented Herrera's service record, pages of commendations and photographs of him at award ceremonies. A smiling man in uniform appeared on the projection screen, standing with colleagues, with his children, with the Mexican flag behind him. Cruz's voice rose as he pointed, "This was a father. This was a colleague. This was a man who upheld the law. And this man was strangled to death by the defendant sitting before you." The words rang out like a hammer, but the defense countered with a different arsenal. Former inmates were called to the stand. One by one, women spoke of encounters with Herrera. Some described subtle suggestions, offers of cigarettes in exchange for favors. One recalled being cornered in the shower block, the echo of his boots trapping her. She admitted nothing happened, but the implication had been clear. Another described being offered medication if she would agree to keep him company. Each testimony chipped away at the pristine portrait painted by the prosecution, replacing it with something darker, more predatory. The jury listened, faces impassive, but their stillness betrayed attention. Each story added weight, not conclusive proof, but the kind of cumulative suspicion that could not be easily dismissed. Cross-examinations became battlegrounds. Cruz pressed the witnesses, demanding specifics, timelines, physical proof. "Why didn't you report it? Why wait until now?" The women faltered, some admitting fear, others acknowledging futility. Inmates who accused guards often faced retaliation, and most complaints disappeared into silence. The jury absorbed not only their words, but the tremor in their voices, the fear still present even outside the prison walls. The forensic team was recalled to reaffirm its findings. Again, Dr. Cornejo detailed the fractured hyoid bone, the bruises, the DNA, but when pressed by the defense about the unexplained blood, her words shifted slightly. It was fresh, she admitted, deposited within hours of the guard's death. Someone else's presence cannot be ruled out. The sentence carried a weight disproportionate to its length. It rippled across the courtroom, through the jury box, into the gallery. For the defense, it was an opening wide enough to drive their narrative through. For the prosecution, it was a crack they could not plaster over. The judge reminded the jury that speculation was not evidence, but speculation had already infected the air. Reporters scribbled furiously, seizing on the idea of an unseen woman, a ghost in the cell. The tabloids were quick to christen her La Tercera Sombra, the third shadow. Who was she? Another inmate, a nurse, a smuggler slipping through the prison's hidden corridors. The unanswered question fed every column inch. Behind closed doors, whispers leaked to the press. Anonymous sources claimed Herrera had knowledge of a contraband pipeline. Drugs and phones ferried into Santa Lucia with the cooperation of guards. If true, his death could have been orchestrated not by passion, but by necessity, an execution disguised as a failed assault. The disabled cameras fit too neatly into that theory to ignore. Each day, Camila was paraded into court in chains, her expression hardened into something between defiance and exhaustion. Cameras captured her every step. The tabloids dubbed her La Viuda de la Celda, the widow of the cell. To her supporters, the nickname carried sympathy, painting her as a woman forced into survival. To her critics, it became an accusation, branding her a black widow who lured a man to his death. The trial, once about one crime, had become about the prison itself. Each testimony, each photograph, each piece of evidence exposed the cracks in the walls of Santa Lucia: corruption, coercion, the secret economy that thrived in shadow. For the jury, the decision was no longer simple guilt or innocence. It was a choice between narratives: Herrera the fallen officer, or Herrera the predator silenced by the violence he had provoked. And always, in the background, there lingered the blood on the sheet, a stain that did not belong to Herrera, nor to Camila, nor to Sofia, a witness that could not speak, yet spoke louder than any of them. The trial reached its end after weeks of testimony, cross-examinations, and arguments that carved the courtroom into rival camps. By the final day, the gallery was full to the walls. Families of guards sat shoulder to shoulder with families of inmates. Reporters filled every aisle. Outside, the chanting of protesters drifted faintly through the windows, a chorus of competing truths that the law could not reconcile. The jury filed back into the room in silence, their expressions unreadable. Each step echoed too loudly against the polished floor. The foreman unfolded a slip of paper and, without hesitation, read the words that had been written behind closed doors: guilty of homicide. Gasps broke through the chamber. Some clutched each other, some cursed under their breath. Camila Rojas lowered her head, her jaw tight but her eyes dry. She did not weep. She did not plead. The judge's voice followed with formal precision, 15 additional years added to her sentence. She would remain in Santa Lucia until middle age, her fate sealed in the very place where the guard had died. Prosecutor Cruz faced the cameras outside the courthouse, his words polished but hollow. A life was taken, and the law has spoken. He framed the verdict as justice, as the restoration of order. Yet even as he spoke, the contradictions lingered in every ear. The cameras had been shut down deliberately. The blood belonged to someone who had never stood trial. The questions were still alive, no matter what the verdict declared. The defense vowed to appeal. Attorney Herrera's voice was sharp, exhausted, but unyielding. Another woman's blood was found in that cell. The surveillance was disabled. The state ignored its own evidence. This conviction does not close the case. It proves that the truth was never fully sought. Her words did not change the verdict, but they gave the story another chapter to unfold in the public imagination. In the streets, the reaction fractured further. For some, the conviction was a necessary message that inmates could not kill without consequence, that authority still had weight inside the walls. For others, it was a cover-up, a scapegoat sacrificed to protect a system too rotten to expose itself. Murals appeared in poor neighborhoods. Painted in bright colors on cracked walls, Camila depicted as a saint in shackles, her eyes defiant, a halo painted in chains. Others branded her a predator, a liar, a killer who had ensnared a guard. Inside Santa Lucia, whispers continued. Inmates traded theories over dinner trays, while guards muttered in the shadows of the break room. Some claimed another prisoner had slipped into the cell under the protection of a corrupt officer. Others said Herrera had been silenced because he knew too much about contraband routes. Theories multiplied like mold, feeding on silence, never reaching the official record. The file closed on paper with certainty. Miguel Herrera, strangled to death. Camila Rojas, convicted of homicide. But outside the margins, nothing was settled. A guard whose life carried secrets, an inmate branded both victim and killer, a witness whose testimony was a mirror of contradictions, and the smear of blood from a woman unseen, unnamed, unresolved, a ghost that refused to vanish from the story. When the prison gates clanged shut behind Camila's return, The world moved on. The reporters found new scandals, the protesters new causes. But inside the gray walls of Santa Lucia, the case lingered. Every guard who walked past cell 12 felt it in the silence. Every inmate who whispered her name tasted it in the air. The trial had ended, but the story did not.